Open the door right now or we're coming in. The pounding against the diner's glass front shook the silverware harder than the thunder outside. Rain slammed against the neon windows of Rosie's diner in South Side Chicago, turning the empty streets into rivers of blurred red and blue reflections. Naomi Carter froze behind the counter, one hand gripping the edge of the register so tightly her knuckles turned pale beneath her brown skin. The old wall clock above the coffee machine read 1:13 a.m. 3 customers remained inside, all silent now, their coffee cups untouched as police sirens screamed outside like wolves circling prey. Then came another bang. Louder this time. The front door rattled violently in its frame. Chicago PD. Open up. Naomi swallowed hard and looked toward the kitchen hallway. That was when she saw him. A tall white man in a rain-soaked charcoal coat stumbled out from the back storage room, breathing heavily, one hand pressed against his ribs. Water dripped from his blonde hair onto the black and white tile floor. His expensive leather shoes were soaked with mud, and his face looked nothing like the confident billionaire plastered across every TV screen in America. Ethan Whitmore looked afraid. Not nervous. Not irritated. Afraid. The television mounted above booth 7 flashed his photo again beneath a screaming headline. Whitmore Capital CEO accused in multi-billion-dollar fraud case. A second line followed beneath it. Federal authorities request immediate detention. Naomi stared at the screen, then back at the man standing in her kitchen like a ghost who had wandered in from the storm. Ethan's breathing was uneven now. He glanced toward the diner entrance as another thunderclap shook the windows. Please, he said quietly, his voice rough from exhaustion. Don't let them see me. Naomi's jaw tightened. Of all people. Ethan Whitmore. The billionaire whose company had bought half the neighborhood 3 years ago. The same company that forced dozens of families out of their apartment buildings after property taxes tripled overnight. Naomi still remembered carrying boxes down 6 flights of stairs while her mother tried not to cry. She remembered eviction notices taped across doors like death certificates. She remembered the way her mother stopped smiling after that winter. Another violent knock exploded against the diner entrance. One of the officers shouted again. Ma'am, this is your final warning. Naomi's pulse hammered in her ears. Ethan leaned against the stainless steel counter for balance, clearly struggling to stay upright. Up close, he didn't look powerful anymore. His white dress shirt was wrinkled beneath the coat. His hands trembled slightly from cold or fear or both. This wasn't the men from magazine covers standing beside private jets and billion-dollar skyscrapers. This was just a tired man being hunted through the rain. For one long second, Naomi said nothing. The diner hummed softly around them. Coffee burners hissed. Rain hammered the roof. Police lights painted the walls in flashing shades of red and blue. Then Ethan looked directly at her and spoke again, quieter this time. If you turn me in, he said, I won't blame you. Naomi stared at him, her expression unreadable. Outside, the officers reached 3. 1. Her heart pounded harder. 2. The door shook again. Naomi inhaled slowly, then stepped toward the front entrance. And when she finally unlocked the door, she only opened it halfway. Rain blew inside immediately, cold against her face as 2 officers pushed toward the entrance. Did a man come through here? One demanded. Naomi looked back once toward the kitchen. Ethan Whitmore stood completely still beneath the flickering fluorescent light, waiting for his fate. Then Naomi turned back to the officers and said the one thing neither side expected to hear. No, officers, she said calmly. Nobody came in tonight. The officers studied Naomi carefully, the kind of stare people gave when they were trying to decide whether fear or truth was standing in front of them. Rainwater dripped from the brim of the older officer's cap onto the diner floor as he glanced past her shoulder toward the empty booths and flickering kitchen lights. You sure about that? He asked. Naomi crossed her arms tightly against the cold draft blowing through the half-open door. I have been cleaning up since midnight, she answered evenly. Nobody came in except my regulars. One of the customers near the window lowered his eyes immediately and lifted his coffee cup without speaking. The younger officer stepped closer, flashlight still in hand. We tracked movement in this area less than 5 minutes ago, he said. Male suspect. 6'2". White. Dark coat. Naomi shrugged once. That describes half of Chicago tonight. The older officer did not smile. Behind Naomi, somewhere deep in the kitchen, a metal pen shifted softly. Her stomach tightened instantly. For one terrible second, she thought the officers heard it too. But outside, thunder exploded overhead at the perfect moment, rattling the windows hard enough to shake the hanging menu boards. The younger officer looked back toward the street where flashing squad cars painted the rain silver and blue. "If you see anything," he said, "you call immediately. Harboring a fugitive is obstruction." Naomi nodded slowly. "Understood." Then the officers finally stepped back into the storm. The door shut. The lock clicked. Silence swallowed the diner again except for the endless rain hammering the roof. Naomi stood motionless for a few seconds, staring through the fogged glass as police lights disappeared farther down the street. Only then did she exhale. Slowly. Carefully. Like someone releasing air from a cracked lung. Behind her, Ethan Whitmore leaned against the kitchen doorway, exhausted. "You should not have done that," he said quietly. Naomi turned sharply. "Do not confuse kindness with trust." Her voice carried more weight now, harder than before. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, almost like he understood he deserved it. The television above the counter switched to another breaking news segment. A polished anchorwoman appeared beneath giant red letters reading "National Manhunt." Authorities continue searching for billionaire investor Ethan Whitmore following allegations involving illegal offshore accounts, bribery, and financial misconduct tied to Whitmore Capital redevelopment projects. Naomi grabbed the remote and muted the television instantly. The diner suddenly felt smaller after that. Tighter. Like the walls themselves were listening. Ethan sank slowly into booth 4 near the back window. His expensive coat was still dripping onto the cracked vinyl seat. Naomi noticed how pale he looked beneath the fluorescent lights. Not weak exactly. Just worn down. Human. She hated that part most. She hated that the men she had spent years blaming for her family's collapse did not look like a monster tonight. He looked tired. "You have a first aid kit?" he asked after a moment. Naomi hesitated. Then she walked behind the counter and grabbed the faded red box stored beneath the coffee station. She tossed it onto the table harder than necessary. Ethan opened it carefully, but the moment he tried wrapping his own hand, he winced slightly. Naomi noticed immediately. "Give me that," she muttered. Ethan looked surprised. "You already did enough." "Clearly not," she replied. She sat across from him and pulled the bandage from his trembling fingers. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Outside, the storm softened into steady rain. Inside, the neon diner lights buzzed quietly above their heads while Naomi cleaned the scrape along his hand with practiced care. Then Ethan looked at her more carefully than before. "Have we met?" he asked softly. Naomi paused for half a second. Her eyes lifted slowly to meet his. "No," she said. "But your company destroyed my neighborhood." The words landed heavier than the thunder ever could. For a moment, Ethan Whitmore said nothing at all. The rain outside softened into a cold steady rhythm against the diner windows while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead like tired insects trapped in glass. Naomi kept wrapping the bandage around his hand, her movements controlled and sharp, but inside her chest old memories were rising like floodwater. She remembered the day the notices appeared on every apartment door in her neighborhood. Final redevelopment warning. 30 days to vacate. 30 days to erase generations. Old men who used to play chess outside the barber shop disappeared first. Then the grocery store closed. Then the church. Then came luxury towers with rooftop pools nobody from the neighborhood could afford to see, let alone live in. Whitmore Capital called it urban renewal. Naomi's mother called it burial with better lighting. Ethan finally leaned back against the booth, studying her carefully. "I never handled individual displacement cases myself," he said quietly. Naomi laughed once under her breath, but there was no humor in it. "That is the thing about powerful people," she replied. "You destroy lives from conference rooms and call it paperwork." Ethan lowered his eyes again. Somewhere near the coffee station, the old refrigerator motor rattled to life. The sound filled the silence between them for a few long seconds. Naomi stood and walked behind the counter, pretending to organize sugar packets just to keep her hands busy. Because the truth was more dangerous than the police outside. Part of her wanted to hate him completely. It would have been easier that way. But hate worked best from a distance, and now the men responsible for so much damage sat 10 feet away looking exhausted enough to fall apart. Ethan loosened his soap tie slowly. "My father built Whitmore Capital from one office above a hardware store," he said. "He used to tell me that if you wanted to survive in business, you could never hesitate." Naomi wiped down the counter harder than necessary. "And did he teach you what happens to people underneath those decisions?" Ethan did not answer immediately. The television above the counter suddenly switched from news coverage to shaky phone footage recorded earlier that evening. Reporters crowded outside a downtown courthouse while financial analysts shouted over one another about frozen accounts and federal investigations. One commentator called Ethan Whitmore the symbol of corporate greed in modern America. Another called him a genius under attack. Naomi muted the television again before Ethan could react. "You should probably sleep for an hour before sunrise," she said coldly. "The morning crowd starts at 5. Ethan glanced toward the storm-dark windows. "You are still helping me after everything." Naomi folded her arms tightly. "Do not make this bigger than it is. I am not helping a billionaire. I am helping a man who looked terrified." That sentence hit harder than she expected. Ethan looked away immediately, almost ashamed someone had noticed. Naomi hated herself a little for saying it out loud. Outside, another squad car rolled slowly past the diner, headlights sweeping across the glass like prison searchlights. Both of them froze until the vehicle disappeared down the block. Ethan exhaled slowly afterward and rubbed his tired face with one hand. For the first time all night, he looked older than 39. Not because of wrinkles or gray hair. Because fear had stripped away the armor money usually built around men like him. Naomi watched him quietly from across the diner. Then she remembered something her mother used to say after every eviction meeting, every rejected loan application, every insult disguised as policy. Sometimes the people with the most power are also the loneliest. Back then Naomi never believed it. Tonight she was starting to. By 3:30 in the morning, the storm outside had faded into a cold mist that wrapped itself around the empty Chicago streets like smoke. Rosie's diner felt suspended in time, floating somewhere between yesterday's disaster and tomorrow's headlines. Naomi stood behind the counter refilling the sugar dispensers for the breakfast shift while Ethan Whitmore sat silently in booth 4 staring at the untouched cup of black coffee cooling in front of him. The television remained muted above them, but the captions kept rolling nonstop beneath images of federal agents, courthouse steps, and flashing cameras. Every few minutes another headline appeared beside Ethan's face. Market collapse. Investor panic. Manhunt continues. Naomi tried not to look at the screen anymore. It made the diner feel dangerous. Like trouble itself was sitting in booth 4 wearing a $1,000 watch and exhaustion behind the eyes. "You should sleep," Naomi finally said without looking up. Ethan gave a faint shake of his head. "Every time I close my eyes tonight, I see reporters outside my office." Naomi slid a stack of clean menus into place. "That sounds like a rich people problem." Ethan almost smiled at that, but the expression disappeared before it fully arrived. He looked around the diner instead. The cracked leather booths. The faded pie display. The coffee stains older than some marriages. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. "Since I was 22. "You own it." Naomi laughed softly. "If I owned this place, the milkshake machine would actually work." Ethan glanced toward the broken machine near the kitchen doors and nodded slowly like he understood more than he let on. Naomi hated that too. She hated when powerful people suddenly acted human after spending years above everyone else. The diner clock ticked loudly through another silence. Then Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Your mother," he said carefully. "What happened to her?" Naomi stopped moving entirely. Outside, a bus rolled past the diner, its headlights briefly washing pale gold across the windows. "Stress happened," she answered quietly. "After we lost our apartment, she worked double shifts at St. Mary's laundry service for 3 years straight." Her voice stayed calm, but every word carried weight now. She stopped sleeping. Stopped eating right. Kept saying things would get better once the city finished rebuilding the neighborhood. Naomi folded a dish towel slowly between her hands. But the rebuilding never included us. Ethan looked down at the table. Naomi continued before she could stop herself. Do you know what the cruelest part is? She asked. The coffee shop built where our apartment used to be sells $12 pastries to people who complain about parking spaces. Ethan closed his eyes briefly after hearing that. Not defensive. Not angry. Just tired in a way money could not fix. I did not know, he admitted quietly. Naomi crossed her arms. That does not make it disappear. No, Ethan said. It does not. Somewhere near the kitchen, the old radio switched on automatically with the morning timer, filling the diner with soft jazz and weather reports about flooded streets downtown. The ordinary sound made everything feel stranger somehow. Like the world outside was continuing normally while two people from completely different lives sat trapped inside the same storm. Then Naomi noticed Ethan staring toward the framed photographs hanging beside the register. Old neighborhood pictures. Church cookouts. High school basketball teams. Community block parties from years before the redevelopment projects began. Ethan stood slowly and walked toward them. His eyes lingered on one photograph in particular. Naomi at 16 beside her mother in front of the old apartment building. Everyone smiling. Everyone still home. What was the address? He asked quietly. Naomi hesitated. 83rd and Princeton. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Not dramatically. Just enough for Naomi to notice. Like a man suddenly remembering something he wished he could forget. My God, he whispered under his breath. That project. Naomi narrowed her eyes immediately. What about it? Ethan stared at the photograph a second longer before answering. That was the first redevelopment deal I ever approved alone. Naomi stared at Ethan Whitmore as if the diner floor had suddenly tilted beneath her feet. The fluorescent lights above them buzzed softly while steam curled from the untouched coffee between them, but neither of them moved. Outside, dawn had begun bleeding slowly into the Chicago sky, turning the rain clouds a dull gray-blue over empty streets. You approved it, Naomi repeated quietly. Ethan looked at the photograph again, his jaw tightening. I was 31, he said. My father had just stepped down as chief executive. Everybody in the company said that redevelopment project would change the South Side forever. Naomi folded her arms harder across her chest. It did. Ethan nodded once, but there was no pride left in him now. Back then all I saw were numbers. Property values. Investment projections. Revenue charts. He paused briefly before continuing. I never visited the neighborhood myself. Naomi laughed softly again, but this time it sounded closer to heartbreak than anger. Of course you did not. Ethan turned toward her slowly. I know apologizing sounds meaningless now. Because it is. The words came fast and sharp. Naomi stepped closer before she could stop herself. You know what people like you never understand. Poor neighborhoods are not empty land waiting for rich people to discover them. Families live there. Memories live there. Her eyes glistened under the diner lights now, though her voice never cracked. My mother planted tomatoes outside that apartment every summer. Kids played basketball in the alley until midnight. Mrs. Robinson downstairs made peach cobbler for every birthday in the building. Ethan listened without interrupting. Naomi pointed toward the photographs hanging beside the register. That place mattered before your company decided it was ugly. Silence settled heavily between them. Not angry silence anymore. Worse. The kind that forced truth into the room whether anyone wanted it or not. Then Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out his wallet slowly. Naomi's expression hardened instantly. Do not insult me. That is not what this is. Ethan slid a worn photograph from behind his credit cards and placed it gently on the counter. Naomi hesitated before looking down. It showed a much younger Ethan standing beside an older man in front of a tiny hardware store with faded red lettering above the entrance. Both smiling. Both wearing cheap jackets instead of tailored suits. My father grew up poor in Cleveland, Ethan said quietly. By the time I took over Whitmore Capital, I spent so many years trying to prove I belonged in those boardrooms that I stopped seeing regular people altogether. Naomi kept staring at the photograph. That sounds convenient. No, Ethan answered softly. It sounds pathetic. The honesty in that sentence caught her off guard. Powerful men were usually experts at excuses. But Ethan Whitmore looked like a man running out of strength to hide behind them. The morning news switched again on the muted television overhead. This time footage showed federal agents carrying boxes out of Whitmore Capital headquarters while reporters crowded the sidewalks outside. One headline rolled beneath the screen. Board members under investigation. Possible internal conspiracy. Ethan looked up at the television for only a second before turning away. Naomi noticed something then that she had missed all night. Fear was not the only thing haunting him. There was betrayal too. Deep enough to hollow someone out from the inside. What actually happened? She asked quietly. Ethan leaned against the booth again, exhausted. 3 weeks ago I discovered members of my executive board had been moving money through offshore accounts tied to redevelopment contracts. Naomi narrowed her eyes. Your company? Yes, Ethan admitted. But not with my approval. Naomi wanted to doubt him immediately. It would have been easier. Cleaner. But something about the way he said it felt different from the polished lies wealthy men usually rehearsed for cameras. Then Ethan looked directly at her and asked the one question she never expected. If someone told you your entire life was built on damage you never stopped long enough to see, he said quietly, how would you live with that? Naomi opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, headlights suddenly flooded the diner windows from outside. Naomi's heart jumped the moment bright headlights washed across the diner windows like prison spotlights. Ethan stood instantly from the booth, every trace of exhaustion replaced by raw instinct. For half a second, neither of them spoke. Outside, 2 black SUVs rolled slowly to the curb through the wet Chicago streets, their tires hissing against rain-soaked asphalt. Naomi's stomach tightened. Police, she whispered. Ethan looked through the glass carefully, tension carved deep into his face. No, he said quietly. Worse. The SUVs stopped directly outside Rosie's diner. Their engines remained running. Dark tinted windows reflected the flickering neon sign while steam rose from the street drains around them. Naomi noticed Ethan's breathing change immediately. Faster now. Sharper. The kind of fear that came from recognition. Who are they? She asked. Ethan kept staring outside. Members of my board. Naomi frowned. Your own people are hunting you. Ethan gave a hollow laugh under his breath. People do strange things when billions of dollars are involved. The front passenger door of the first SUV opened slowly. A tall man stepped out wearing a navy overcoat and leather gloves despite the humid morning air. Silver hair. Expensive shoes. Calm posture. The kind of men who looked more dangerous. Smiling than shouting. Ethan's expression darkened the second he saw him. Victor Lang. Naomi looked back toward the window. Who is that? Chief Financial Officer of Whitmore Capital. Ethan's voice dropped lower now. And the men who probably started all of this. Victor adjusted his coat and glanced toward the diner entrance while another man stepped out beside him carrying a slim black umbrella. No police lights. No reporters. Just silence and expensive vehicles waiting outside like sharks circling dark water. Naomi looked back at Ethan. Maybe you should leave through the alley. But Ethan did not move. He looked strangely calm now, almost resigned. If Victor found me, then they already know every possible exit. Naomi hated how quickly the diner suddenly felt too small again. The old coffee machines. The cracked stools. The faded pie menu. None of it looked safe anymore. Then came 3 soft knocks against the diner door. Not aggressive. Not rushed. Somehow that made it worse. Victor stood outside smiling politely through the glass as if arriving for brunch instead of a manhunt. Naomi stared at him carefully. Wealthy people always wore danger differently. No yelling. No panic. Just polished confidence sharp enough to cut through rooms quietly. Ethan rubbed one tired hand across his face. Do not open it. Another knock came. Slower this time. Victor raised one finger politely toward the glass as if asking permission. Naomi looked between the two men. One outside dressed like control itself. One inside looking like a man whose empire had collapsed overnight. You said they framed you, she whispered. Ethan nodded once. Because I was about to expose them. Naomi studied his face carefully. Fear rarely looked honest on rich men. But this did. Then Victor spoke loudly enough through the glass for them to hear. Ethan, he called smoothly. You cannot hide in diners forever. Naomi saw Ethan's jaw tighten instantly. Victor smiled wider after noticing movement inside. Federal agents are already preparing arrest warrants, he continued calmly. Come outside now and maybe we can still manage the story. The word story hung in the air like poison. Naomi suddenly understood something important. This was not just about money. It was about image. About power. About controlling who became the villain when everything collapsed. Ethan stepped back from the window slowly. If I go with him, he said quietly, I disappear before the truth reaches anyone. Naomi crossed her arms tightly. And if you stay? Ethan looked toward her then. Really looked at her. Then eventually they destroy both of us. The diner fell silent again except for the soft tapping rain and the distant sound of early morning traffic beginning to wake across the city. Naomi glanced toward the old family photographs beside the register. Her neighborhood. Her mother. Her past. Then she looked back at Ethan Whitmore standing alone in the middle of Rosie's diner with nowhere left to run. For the first time all night, she realized something terrifying. She no longer believed he was the real enemy. Victor Lang knocked one final time before opening the diner door himself. A cold gust of wet Chicago air swept inside with him, carrying the smell of rain, gasoline, and expensive cologne. The tiny bell above the entrance chimed softly, almost politely, as if the morning itself did not realize danger had just walked through the door. Victor removed his leather gloves one finger at a time while surveying the diner with calm amusement. His eyes briefly landed on Naomi behind the counter before settling on Ethan. There you are, he said smoothly. You have caused quite a mess tonight. Ethan stood motionless near booth 4, exhaustion written across every inch of him. You mean your mess, he replied quietly. Victor smiled slightly at that. Still dramatic even now. The second man remained near the entrance holding the umbrella and watching the street outside carefully. Naomi noticed an earpiece hidden beneath his collar. Not security exactly. Something colder. More corporate. Victor stepped farther inside, shoes clicking softly across the black and white tile floor. Federal investigators raided headquarters at 2:15 this morning, he said casually. Investors are panicking. Markets open in less than 3 hours. He glanced around Rosie's diner again. With visible curiosity. And somehow the great Ethan Whitmore ended up hiding beside a broken milkshake machine. Naomi folded her arms tightly. He is not hiding anymore. Victor finally looked directly at her. Really looked. The kind of glance wealthy men gave service workers when trying to decide whether they mattered. And you are. Naomi held his gaze without blinking. The person standing between you and whatever this is. Victor chuckled softly under his breath. Loyalty is dangerous when attached to the wrong people. Naomi answered immediately. Funny. I was about to say the same thing to you. Ethan closed his eyes briefly like someone already tired of the entire conversation. Victor walked toward booth 4 and placed a slim folder onto the table. You should read this before the agents arrive, he said calmly. Ethan did not touch it. Victor sighed almost theatrically. You really still believe you can fix this, do not you? Ethan looked up slowly. I know what you did with the redevelopment accounts. Victor's expression barely changed. That was what made him frightening. Careful, he replied softly. Accusations sound unstable coming from fugitives. Naomi watched the tension between them sharpen like a wire pulled too tight. Neither man raised his voice. They did not need to. Power rarely shouted when it already controlled the room. Victor tapped the folder once with one gloved finger. Everything in there transfers responsibility directly onto you, he said. The board signed unanimously at 4 this morning. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. You forged my authorization. Victor tilted his head slightly. No. You gave us years of signatures to learn from. Naomi felt the air leave her lungs after hearing that. Ethan looked less shocked than disappointed now, like betrayal had finally exhausted him beyond anger. Victor stepped closer. Take the deal, he said quietly. Disappear for a few years. Let the company survive. Ethan laughed once under his breath. You destroyed entire neighborhoods to protect stock prices. Victor adjusted his cufflinks calmly. And your company became worth $48 billion because of it. The diner fell. Silent again. Naomi suddenly understood the real difference between the two men standing in front of her. Ethan had spent years becoming cold enough to survive power. Victor had become empty enough to enjoy it. Then Victor turned toward Naomi one final time. You seem intelligent, he said. So let me offer some advice. Men like Ethan Whitmore do not change. They simply panic differently once consequences arrive. Naomi looked toward Ethan. Rainwater still clung to his coat. His face looked exhausted beneath the fluorescent lights. But for the first time all night, she also saw something else there. Regret. Real regret. The kind that arrived too late to undo damage but still hurt anyway. Victor slipped his gloves back on slowly. Federal agents will be here within the hour, he said. When they come, this diner becomes part of the investigation too. Then he smiled politely at Naomi. I wonder if your job survives that. And with that, Victor Lang turned and walked back into the gray Chicago morning, leaving the diner colder than before. The diner stayed silent long after Victor Lang disappeared into the rain. Naomi stood near the counter staring at the closed glass door while the soft hum of old refrigerators filled the empty space around them. Outside, the black SUVs finally pulled away from the curb one at a time, their dark windows disappearing into the wet Chicago streets like shadows retreating before sunrise. Ethan remained motionless beside booth 4, the unopened folder still sitting in front of him like a loaded weapon nobody wanted to touch. The first pale streaks of morning light had begun creeping through the diner windows now, washing the old photographs on the walls in tired gold. Rosie's diner suddenly looked older than ever. Older than Naomi remembered. Every cracked stool. Every faded menu. Every coffee stain layered into the counter after decades of long nights and harder lives. You should leave before the breakfast crowd arrives, Naomi said quietly. Ethan did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the folder Victor left behind. Finally, he spoke. Rosie's diner is behind on property taxes. Naomi stiffened instantly. How do you know that? Ethan gave a weak smile without humor. Whitmore Capital owns the debt portfolio for most of this block. Naomi felt her stomach sink. Of course they did. In cities like Chicago, powerful people rarely just owned buildings anymore. They owned the debt beneath them too. How long? Ethan asked softly. Naomi looked away toward the coffee machines. 3 months. Ethan nodded slowly like he had already expected the answer. Then Victor was not bluffing. Naomi crossed her arms tightly. I am not losing this place too. The words escaped before she could stop them. Ethan finally looked up at her fully. You care about this diner? Naomi laughed softly under her breath. This diner paid for my mother's medicine when insurance stopped covering it. It helped my brother finish community college. Half the neighborhood eats here on credit after bad weeks. Her voice lowered slightly. Places like this are the only reason some people still feel seen. Ethan glanced around the diner again, but differently now. Not as a businessman calculating square footage or revenue. As someone finally noticing what money could not measure. Then he slowly opened Victor's folder. Naomi watched his expression darken with every page. Corporate transfers. Signature authorizations. Offshore accounts. False approvals tied directly to his name. It was not just a setup. It was a burial. They built the entire case around me, Ethan whispered. Naomi stepped closer despite herself. Can you prove it? Ethan exhaled heavily. Maybe. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat again and pulled out a small silver flash drive. Naomi frowned. What is that? The reason Victor looked nervous. Ethan held the drive carefully between his fingers. 3 years of internal board communications. Secret redevelopment payments. Offshore transfers. Illegal campaign donations. Naomi stared at the tiny piece of metal like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Then why are you hiding in diners instead of going to the FBI? Ethan looked exhausted again suddenly. Because half the people investigating this have financial ties to Whitmore Capital. Naomi fell silent after hearing that. The city outside continued waking slowly beyond the windows. Delivery trucks rolled through puddles. Streetlights flickered off one by one. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang 7 times through the damp morning air. Then the front door opened unexpectedly. Naomi turned instantly, heart jumping again, but relaxed when she saw old Mr. Delaney from the apartment building across the street shuffling inside with his newspaper tucked beneath one arm. "Morning, kid," he mumbled sleepily before noticing Ethan. His eyes narrowed slightly. Naomi moved quickly. "Kitchen inspection," she lied smoothly. Mr. Delaney grunted without caring much and slid into his usual booth beside the window. Naomi poured his coffee automatically while Ethan watched her quietly from across the diner. "You lied again," he said softly once Mr. Delaney stopped paying attention. Naomi handed over the coffee cup without looking back at Ethan. "Do not make me regret it." Ethan stared down at the flash drive resting in his palm. Then, for the first time all night, he asked the question that truly changed everything. "If I expose all of this," he said quietly, "would your neighborhood ever forgive me?" Naomi paused beside the counter for a long moment before answering. "No," she said honestly. "But maybe they could finally stop hurting." By 8:15 that morning, Rosie's diner was fuller than usual. Construction workers in reflective jackets crowded the front booths while nurses coming off overnight shifts wrapped cold hands around coffee mugs near the windows. The smell of bacon, toast, and burnt coffee drifted through the air beneath the soft crackle of old jazz music playing from the kitchen radio. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving downtown Chicago washed clean beneath pale morning sunlight. But inside the diner, tension still clung to the walls like smoke. Naomi moved between tables refilling cups mechanically while Ethan remained hidden in the back office beside stacks of unpaid invoices and supply receipts. Every television in the diner now carried the same breaking story. Whitmore Capital Board under federal investigation. Leaked documents suggest internal fraud network. Naomi glanced toward the office door every few seconds. 2 hours earlier, Ethan had disappeared inside with his phone and the silver flash drive. Since then, he had made 3 calls. One to an independent federal prosecutor in New York. One to a financial journalist at the Chicago Tribune. And one to his younger sister Claire, the only family member he still trusted. The entire time, Naomi expected black SUVs to return or federal agents to storm through the diner entrance. But they never came. Instead, the city itself seemed to shift hour by hour. By 9:30, reporters outside Whitmore Capital headquarters were no longer asking where Ethan Whitmore was hiding. They were asking why Victor Lang's private accounts suddenly matched millions in illegal redevelopment transfers leaked anonymously overnight. At booth 6, 2 retired teachers whispered over their pancakes while watching the news. "Looks like the rich are eating each other alive now," one muttered. Naomi kept pouring coffee silently, but inside she felt something strange unfolding. Not victory exactly. Something quieter. Like years of buried anger finally cracking open enough to breathe. Then the diner door swung open hard enough for the bell above it to rattle sharply. Every head turned. Naomi froze instantly. 3 dark SUVs had parked outside again. But this time there were no hidden smiles or polished threats waiting behind the glass. Federal agents entered first carrying identification badges while reporters crowded the sidewalk outside holding cameras toward the windows. The entire diner went silent except for the hiss of the grill in the kitchen. One of the agents stepped forward calmly. "We are looking for Ethan Whitmore." Naomi's pulse slammed against her ribs. Around her, customers exchanged nervous glances. Mr. Delaney slowly lowered his newspaper. The young cashier beside the pie display looked ready to faint. Then, before Naomi could speak, the back office door opened quietly behind her. Ethan stepped out wearing the same wrinkled coat from the night before, but something about him looked different now. Not stronger. Just honest for the first time in years. The diner watched in complete silence as he walked toward the agents. "I am right here," he said calmly. Reporters outside immediately erupted into chaos, camera flashes exploding through the windows like lightning. One agent stepped closer. "Mr. Whitmore, are you prepared to cooperate with the investigation?" Ethan glanced toward Naomi before answering. "Completely." Another reporter shouted from outside the glass. "Did you orchestrate the redevelopment fraud?" Ethan paused for one long moment. The entire diner seemed to stop breathing with him. Then he answered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I built an empire without paying attention to who got crushed underneath it," he admitted. "That failure belongs to me." Naomi stared at him in shock. Powerful men rarely confessed anything publicly. Especially not the truth. Ethan continued before the reporters could interrupt. "But the people responsible for stealing from neighborhoods and manipulating federal contracts will finally face exposure today." One reporter shouted another question, but Ethan ignored it. Instead, he turned fully toward Naomi in front of the entire diner. The room fell silent again. Even the kitchen stopped moving. Ethan reached into his coat pocket slowly and pulled out a folded set of documents. "Rosie's diner is debt-free effective immediately," he said. Naomi blinked in disbelief. Ethan placed the papers gently on the counter beside her trembling hands. "The building title has been transferred into your name." Gasps rippled across the diner instantly. Naomi stared down at the documents without breathing. Ethan's voice softened slightly after that. "Last night," he said quietly, "a waitress protected me when she had every reason not to." His eyes met hers one final time. "You reminded me that people matter more than power ever will." Outside, cameras continued flashing beneath the cold Chicago sun while federal agents waited patiently nearby. But inside Rosie's diner, nobody moved for several seconds. Because for the first time in a very long time, justice did not look like revenge. It looked like truth finally learning how to speak.